Wonderful. Welcome back. I'm spontaneously talking to the critical dragon, and I'll try to don my role as the hypercritical halfling, I guess, and we'll see where this is going. Um, well, thanks for actually doing this on such short notice.
No
It's
problem
almost
at all.
like a year ago since we talked the last time, I think.
Yeah, it's been quite some time. So it's good to see you again, Ralph.
Yeah. I'm glad this works, and I've brought myself a beer to cure my hangover. So, cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah. So I guess what we're going to do today is talk a bit more about like the publishing side of things. I think that's sort of, and the responsibilities of authors, because that's sort of where this kind of started out with. And
Well, you'd made a really interesting comment that sometimes in a series or sometimes in an ongoing work, that something will crop up and you look at the book and you're like, where did this come from? And it turns out it's something from a short story or a comic book or some sort of spin-off narrative or additional narrative that isn't part of the main series, but is essential to understanding what's going on in the main narrative. That was the point that you had made, and sometimes it rubs you the wrong way.
So my example was I'm currently reading the Dresden Files with Cal from Really Good and Kind, and we talked about Small Favors, the 10th book last time, and we're supposed to talk about the 11th one, Turncoat. Well, we're supposed to talk about it last week, and then Cal got sick. But the point is, and this is obviously a spoiler for that specific, 10th Dresden Files novel. There is a situation where one of Harry's best friends gets like almost killed. And it is fairly clear that at the end of the day, he just barely survives and will be disabled from that point on and no longer able to, be the kind of person he was before. And I was really happy because it's like finally there's consequences in these books. And then in book 11, it just never gets mentioned. There's like one line at near the end when someone is talking to her and it's like, yeah, oh, this is the place where this guy got crippled. I'm like, if there's something missing there, there's something missing there. If like your best friend, because of your actions, gets, disabled, like suffers almost terminal injuries, do not mention it at all in the next novel, which is supposed to, take place a year later, is just feels weird to me. And then I complain about it somewhere and someone is like, yeah, but all of this is addressed in a short story. And I'm like, that's okay. I'm glad it is addressed somewhere. But on the other hand, how am I supposed to know that? And do I actually buy into like picking up every single like spin-off narrative, whatever bit and piece is lying around somewhere, to actually get the full picture? And I guess that's sort of where my frustration started from. And obviously also the Expanse novellas being finally actually released as some sort of an omnibus relatively soon. And that's sort of when I'll actually read them, because I don't want to spend one entire Audible credit for like a half-hour short story. It just feels, so
not particularly economical.
No, exactly. And I guess that's sort of where my frustration came from. And I think there's a bunch of questions there. That one of them is like, what am I actually getting? Is the work, the book series, just a series of novels, the entire world, the intellectual property, to put that word on? That is probably where my frustration with it will come from, which is that we're talking about something as a commodity to be used, and that's why you spread out information over all kinds of things. But that's sort of the question, like what responsibilities does the author have, I guess, the publisher, and what can I expect from like work? Can I expect everything, like the main plots or the main things, to be addressed in just a series of novels, or am I expected to also seek out the other parts of the narrative to actually get the full picture?
Well, you see, I think, well, the Dresden Files one is an interesting example. There's a lot here to actually discuss. But if you think about it, you said the book that follows is a year afterwards.
Yes.
So already the author has told you a year has passed, and that means a year's worth of stuff has happened. So the author, Butcher's already built in. There's a year's worth of stuff that's happened here that I'm not telling you about. And it just so happened that this particular thing that annoyed you happens in that year, that gap.
Yeah.
That one point, does that spoil the majority thrust, the main narrative of what happens in book 10 or book 11, whichever one it is?
Book 11. It kind of, in a way, because the point is, have you read those Dresden Files novels?
I've read all of them, but
all right,
for the life of me, trying to keep all of the different stories straight.
All right,
in my head.
so here's the things. Like at the end of book 10, this is like full spoilers. At the end of book 10, Michael gets almost killed.
Yeah, okay,
and the entirety of book 11, Harry is running around with obviously with Michael's daughter Molly, who is his apprentice and is currently risking her life. So I felt that the fact that he nearly got her dad killed, and apparently now in a wheelchair or whatever, should be reflected at some point in how he treats his daughter, because, you know, guilt or whatever, there should be something there. It just never gets mentioned until like almost the end of the novel, when he's to Molly like, yeah, this is the island where your dad got crippled. And I'm like, is this shitty writing or not? And I was complaining about it. It's like, this didn't feel well. But I would call it shitty writing, and then someone was defending it by saying, yes, the entirety of that trauma is dealt with in a short story.
But even ignoring for a second that the short story exists, let's ignore that point for a second. So yes, this is a traumatic event that happens at the end of one book, and then in the next book, book 11, he's running around a year later. Now, if you think of a trauma that happens in life, and for the first number of months, maybe it is a very, very central concern for a lot of people. And then the number of people who are concerned about it narrows down until essentially it's just the people immediately affected by it.
Yes.
And that's just how our brains work. Life carries on. So in one way, it's actually far more naturalistic for Dresden to be carrying on almost as if that thing didn't happen, and for it to be an afterthought, because this is a full year later that he and Molly and everyone else has come to terms with Michael's injury. Yes. So from one perspective, it's actually naturalistic writing, because that's how the human brain works.
Yes.
But from a reading perspective, because we as readers, we have just read that this thing happened, and now we're reading the next book. And so for us, the time gap is much, much smaller.
Definitely.
And we're like, are you not going to mention this? Is this not a thing that needs to be talked about? And so we get into the sort of the distinction between what a character knows and what a reader knows, and what is important to a character versus what is important to a reader. And Wolfgang Iser talks about this in terms of the gap theory, the gap of knowledge between those two different perspectives. So on the one hand, I can quite easily defend Butcher on this point by saying it's naturalistic. But
I would argue that this is in general true. But since before, in the books before that, Harry Dresden is always thinking about like whether he could involve Molly in any of these things, because it's like a high risk. But suddenly, when he has almost killed her dad, he has no compunction to risk her life as well. And that's why it felt like if that dynamic wasn't there and hasn't been there before, or she wouldn't be in the book at all for whatever reason, being on like a school trip or whatever, and he would just like fuck around somewhere with someone else and do other stuff, I would not have minded. But it felt weird that it just wasn't brought up, the whole like question of his responsibility towards her.
But then we get Dresden's feeling of responsibility towards Molly. It's further explored as time goes on. So that's an ongoing thing that will be returned to.
I expect so.
Yeah, but it's again, we have this weird thing now as readers that we expect everything that we want to know, we expect to be given right away.
Yeah.
And when we don't get it right when we want it, we go, but this is bad writing. And it's almost, to call it entitlement is probably too strong, but it's an expectation that we have.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is, we're used to binging a TV series. We're used to, oh, I got the entire series. I didn't have to wait a year and a half or 2 years between books. I just bought the entire series and I read them all back to back. We have this consumer mentality where we buy everything, we read everything. We have an online wiki that we go to that'll answer questions instead of waiting to find the things out. And if you go back 30 years, so not even going back a huge amount of time, go back 30 years to when books were coming out, and you didn't have that. You didn't have a lot of the same internet chat rooms even where you could talk to other fans. You read the book, you thought about the book, and the next book came out, and you hoped that it was going to address things and answer things, but that it was a completely different set of expectations. But we live in a different media landscape now, so our expectations are different.
Yeah, I would still maintain that this is sort of weird because he still thinks about responsibility towards other people that he involves in this. And it is actually kind of brought up because at the beginning of the novel, one of his werewolf friends gets killed by a monster that he's sort of involved with. So he gets someone else killed. And he still doesn't even connect the dots with like, shit, I need to, be more careful because last year I got my best friend almost killed. And now I got like another friend killed because of all my irresponsible actions. He doesn't connect it there. And it's like, I don't want the whole book to be about it. I felt it would have been natural in that situation when he starts like, oh, all the consequences of my life. Is like, he doesn't even think about Michael at that point. I'm like, that's odd.
Yeah. And then we could, but then you're getting into a critique of whether or not Butcher is successful in creating a believable character in Harry. And for a lot of people, Harry is believable enough that they don't need full psychological fidelity.
Yeah, of course. That was just like me trying to, because I'm an argumentative kind of person, and you started defending Butcher's writing, and that wasn't actually really where I wanted to go. But when you start like defending him, I have to push back, of course. But where I wanted to go is the fact that like I was like on some Discord server, I think it was Mike's Discord. Anyways, I went like on discussed the book, and I'm like that bit felt odd to me. And felt unrealistic that he doesn't think about it. And then someone else was coming across as rather aggressively telling me that I should not complain about it because it is actually dealt with in that short story. And that's sort of where my idea is like, what are my responsibilities and what am I supposed to do to have the right to talk about this? Or, it's sort of the same thing that we had like recently as well with the Wheel of Time, and the question of like, can I criticize this, or someone will just jump up and tell me to also read the prequel and all the interviews and whatnot, because obviously the author has said something about it. It's like, am I supposed to do all of that to take in the entire intellectual property and other stuff to have the right to talk about it? On the one hand, and that's the other side of it, it's obviously, am I also supposed to actually seek out these things to get like the full picture? Because at some point it feels like this is not just like an added bonus, like a bonus short story or whatever of an adventure someone has while they're off somewhere, but this is actually sort of part of the actual core of the story that's suddenly missing. And am I supposed to do that?
And there's a very important distinction, because if it is essential to the telling of the narrative, if it is a core aspect of the narrative, then you would expect it to be within that particular narrative frame and structure. If it is ancillary, if it is bonus material that lends additional insight or gives you additional depth and exploration of something, that's slightly different. So if we think, because both you and I are fans of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. How many times when people have been reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen, they go, but I really, what this plotline just drops, and the response is, well, if you read the novels of the Malazan Empire by Ian C. Esselmont. We have no problem saying that because we like both series, we've read both series, and we enjoy them. But for someone who is reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen, they go, but I'm reading this one series. Everything that I need to know should be in this series. And we would say, yes, everything you need to know is in the series. Not everything that you want to know, because those are two different things. And when we look at aspects of the Malazan Book of the Fallen that, you know, a plot thread just sort of disappears, or characters disappear and
Yeah.
they appear somewhere else, or there's this backwards and forwards sort of conversation between the two works. That's how both series are structured. But each of the books within the different series works. Each of the books fits the paradigm of a novel. The major arcs are all concluded within it, and the important information is not withheld from the reader.
Yeah,
and that is something different. But if someone said, "Oh, but what about Goats of Glory, the short story that Erickson wrote? That's only available in like one anthology or something." But that's not essential to understanding the Malazan Book of the Fallen, nor is it essential to understanding the novels of the Malazan Empire. What about Path to Ascendancy? Those are not essential to understanding the other series. But all of these are additional works that add and build and can be read on their own as well. Yeah. But you get something different from them. So to take The Wheel of Time, a prequel, by definition, is outside of the series.
Yes.
Because it is before the series. It is a prequel. It comes before the series. Therefore, the series is one thing. The prequel is a separate thing. It is additional information that should not and will not be necessary for the understanding of the main series. But it develops something. It shows you something else.
Yeah.
And it is one of these things that is frustrating in large-scale epic narratives where you have multiple different aspects being told in multiple media or across different narrative events and things.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, that's like the thing there, right? With when I think of Malazan, I think it has something of a unique place in that regard, that it is like this co-developed world with both authors and whatnot. But I think of Malazan in general and all those Malazan works as historiography. And it's like, if I read a history of Rome, it will touch on stuff that happens in Greece. It will touch on stuff that happens in, say, the Persian empires at the same time. It may even also quickly mention something that happens in China at the same time.
Yeah.
But and then I can go and read like a history of China in the same time, and it will also mention stuff and some, like, so to call, if you want to call them narrative or plots or whatever, will like move from one place to another, and then I just pick up another book that deals with that specific subject.
Yeah, and that's like a really good point, because the type of narrative that is being told is going to inform your expectations. Yes. Because if we expect all narratives to conform to one singular expectation, we're denying the existence of all these different narrative forms. And histories or historiographies are an example of a different narrative form.
Yeah.
But if you take something like The Wheel of Time is presented as a singular narrative made up of explicit plot threads that are running through essentially chronologically.
Yeah.
And following a very limited number of people. And that is a very common technique. It is a very common narrative structure. Butcher's Dresden Files is, again, essentially the same sort of thing, of a chronological sequencing of events written chronologically with one major character perspective, where you're following it in that chronology, you're following it in that sequence, and it's each book is meant to be the major narrative event that we're going to be looking at, that you piece it all together for the overarching series narrative.
Yes.
Whereas the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire are not that. Just as Ian M. Banks's culture novels are, it's not the culture series. Here's book 1, here's book 2, here's book 3, and follow the narrative arc. That's not how he constructed it. These are all examples and stories taken from the culture world that you put together as a mosaic to understand the culture at all of these different times and places. So there are different narrative forms.
Yeah.
And I think that's the first point, that yes, there are different narrative forms with different expectations. And because of that, you can't make a general rule saying, oh, it must always be X, because it must always be X in Y type of narrative if the author intended Z. Suddenly you get into all of these qualifiers.
Yeah, of course. And that's, I guess, part of my Dresden Files problem there, is that the Dresden Files are that ongoing narrative, and I expect these things to show up in those main novels. Obviously, maybe it's my special situation that I think that, you know, dealing with almost killing your best friend is something that I expect to be dealt with in the novel, because for me it's a major part of the story. Maybe for other people it's not that much of a big deal, I guess. And so that's sort of what informed is like, this was like a major thing. If it was something like smaller, I would have said like, yeah, sure, like I know there's short stories that deal with that, right? There's stuff like, you know, all the other stuff that Harry does the rest of the year when he's not doing his like yearly novel job, basically. Um,
it's so convenient that these things only happen once a year.
Harry's really lucky there.
But it's a bit like Harry Potter in Hogwarts. It's lucky that these things only happen once a year while we're here during term time. It's a good thing it didn't happen during the summer holidays. That way I'd be screwed.
Yeah, like, you know.
Narrative conveniences aside, but there is something to the building out and taking advantage of different media and different narrative forms. Like Butcher has graphic novel spin-offs and
yes,
short story collections. You know, they will always, to me, be ancillary. They will always be separate. Yes, they're in the same world. Yes, they will build the world out more.
Yeah.
But if you think of the narrative events, you're saying that you think this is an important consideration that should have been taken into account and addressed in the novel.
Yes.
But the actual events of the novel do not hinge on what happened to Michael.
Technically, no. I would say that, so, like, once he goes and risks Molly's life, he should probably think about, like, can I ruin that family more or not? And that would be like a thought that I would have, but maybe that's the problem.
So the thing is, I think it's perfectly acceptable, even while reading a series, to go, like, I'm having a problem with X in this book, and someone can say, oh, read and find out, because that's going to be addressed later. And you go, well, that's fine. If it's addressed later, it's addressed later. But you can still make the comment. And like we've seen this with a lot of people who dislike the Malazan books. And they will say, you know, this isn't dealt with, or this is dealt with poorly. And you go, well, it's set up that way here, but that thread's actually developed later. But you are right in your point here that this is not fully developed here. And you're exactly right. You've identified that. Brilliant. It is addressed later on because this is a huge meta-narrative.
Yeah.
And they'll say, oh, no, but it still annoys me that it's not addressed here. And you go, well, okay, fine. It annoys you. That's a perfectly valid feeling to have.
Yeah.
It does get addressed, though. It's not that the author went, I don't care about this and I'm not dealing with it. So to your point that you had a problem with this in Dresden, that is absolutely fine. Someone's saying, but that's dealt with in a side story. You go, well, that doesn't address your issue, which is, here are the Dresden File books, they're numbered, and it's gone from 10 to 11 without this being addressed. That's a problem in the main series.
Yes.
And you go, yes, it is a problem in the main series. The problem is addressed in a side story that's not part of the main series, which you can or cannot access depending on availability. So in one way, yes, you're perfectly right to say it's a problem. The person saying, but that's addressed there and you can't complain about it is, I would suggest, wrong. Because yes, you can complain about it if it's not in the main series. It's not in the main sequence of events.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's said. Yeah, I guess that's like the point, is like to say, oh, if you're missing it, you might want to check out this short story where it is addressed, is like a nice tip. It's sort of the idea that there is one that the implicit like accusation that I should not be allowed to complain about it is sort of the issue, I guess.
But if you think of people talking about Dune by Frank Herbert, and they'll go, oh, Dune, Paul Atreides, it's the white savior story and all this sort of thing. And everyone goes, have you read Dune Messiah?
Yeah. Robert Jordan didn't.
Because if you read Dune Messiah, which, you know, is intended to be part of that arc, it is very explicit in what it's saying. But even within Dune, when you have Jessica saying, this is a myth that we have seeded the galaxy with in case we need help, that we can use this myth.
Yeah.
And it's about abuse of a savior mythology.
Yes.
And it's explicit in the narrative. So people who gloss over that, A, you can say, well, go and read Dune Messiah, and that'll give you even more insight. But also B, you might want to go back and reread what was actually in the book, because that's actually quite revelatory. The difference here being that's in the book, whereas with your butcher example, it's not in the book. That information was dealt with elsewhere. And you would think maybe if he'd had a paragraph here or a paragraph there, that would have addressed it. And actually that would have completely eased your concern.
Yes. That's about it. It just felt dismissive. Like, this is the island where your father got crippled. I'm like, dude, that's pretty callow.
But if you were watching the original trilogy of Star Wars,
I was waiting for Star Wars to crop up, because it's like the prime example for like
but then you have the prequel trilogy. Is the prequel trilogy essential for understanding the original trilogy?
Hell no.
Is the extended universe, are those books essential? What about the comics? Like, there's a giant franchise where stuff runs in and out of canon, is explicitly part of the universe, and then it's no longer considered part of the universe, that it's just a side story that they're now ignoring. It constantly changes, and there's a completionist aspect to readers, particularly like me. Like, we love reading everything about something and knowing all of these different obscure facts and understanding the tictional universe that these stories happen in.
See, that's an interesting aspect, and I think it's gotten worse over time. That I have like ideas about that in general. That I think it's gotten worse over time, that we expect every single detail to be explained, and it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of people that come from like Malazan and then check out Glenn Cook's Black Company are so frustrated with it, because that story leaves out like almost everything about the world all the time. And people are frustrated with it. Like, the world building is terrible because I don't get any information. I don't even know how magic works. And like, well, deal with it.
Yeah. But the encyclopedic impulse, it is something that secondary world fantasy has to deal with.
Definitely.
Our obsession with world building, and it's, as you said, it's become exaggerated and become a bigger focus, particularly things like magic systems. Like, why is this magic system not explained? You go, why does the magic system need explained? Oh, because it must. And you go, well, when I read a space opera, do I need entire chapters devoted to how their hyperdrive works? No.
I know there's people out there.
It has a warp engine. It can warp. Done. Moving on.
Yeah.
We have bizarre expectations about certain things. And it's fine to have a preference for the style of story. If magic and the use of magic and how magic is used is central to the narrative, then exploring those aspects is going to be very, very important. But if magic just happens to exist in the world, then why would an author need to spend time exploring it? It's just part of the physics of the reality. But when we look at, I'm trying to think of, there was a science fiction TV show called Defiance, and it was a science fiction TV show. It ran on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Okay.
And it was a kind of post-apocalyptic Earth. But it was developed in conjunction with an online role-playing game. And there were aspects of the game turned up in the TV show, and there were aspects of the TV show turned up in the game. And if you wanted the complete narrative, you had to play the game and watch the TV show. And it was very bizarre, because sometimes it wasn't as if when you were watching the TV show, if you were playing the game, you go, oh, I know what that thing is, as kind of an Easter egg, a reward for someone who did both. It was actually aspects of the narrative. You went, I have no idea what's going on unless I played the game. Or if you were playing the game and you go, what the hell is this thing? And it was, you had to have watched the TV show to know suddenly why this thing was happening. That there's a difference between including things as Easter eggs to sort of reward readers who have read lots of different stuff, and having things that are absolutely essential to your narrative, that are coming from a different source. And see, that's where I think the problem sometimes occurs.
I mean, that's sort of like, I find the Defiance example really interesting because it's something that I didn't know about that. And it would have, like, for me, because I can't play the game, obviously, that's a huge problem because I wouldn't even have a chance to actually experience the whole thing. Whereas like an Easter egg example that I found really good, like I had like my issues with the new Dune movie, but one thing that I found really cool is the inclusion of that bull's head, right? The bull head that is sort of not really important for the actual story, but the one where like, Paul Atreides' grandfather was killed by because he was doing dumb bullfighting for whatever reason.
To prove his masculinity.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but so that apparently that's what we do in the future as well. But so they included that in like the set decorations. Like if you have not read the book, it's just like it looks cool, but if you have read the book, you're like, wow, they even did that. And that's a cool Easter egg and a bit of like a nod to those, I don't know, few thousand people that have actually read the Dune books at this point.
But and that's the thing. There's sometimes we get this thing where because something is interesting to us, or we think it is, really brilliant in the books, that we view it as vital for the story. But actually, when you pare it away, you go, it's not. It's not vital for the story.
Yeah.
The story is X, Y, and Z. And you can pare away a lot of the extraneous information. Or like I've talked about this in terms of narrative kernels, which are absolutely essential for the narrative events, and narrative satellites, which are events that can add color, can add depth, can add character development, can add meaning and sense to the world. But ultimately, if you took them away, the world would be a wee bit more gray, the characters a bit more boring, but the events can still happen. And sometimes we fixate on narrative satellites that we think are brilliant, that we think are really interesting.
Yeah.
And we see them as kernels when they're not kernels. And so going back to your example about Dresden, the thing is, while that is an important point to you, and it goes to the psychology of the characters, ultimately, it doesn't have a kernel placement in the narrative. That narrative is not dependent on that thing.
Exactly.
And the narrative works for better or worse without referring to Michael's injury until that point.
Yes.
For you, that is a detriment. But for a lot of other people, they don't know, or they don't notice it really. It doesn't make a big difference because that's not what the story is about. That's not what the story is telling.
Exactly.
And it comes up again later on. Aspects of it get talked about. So there is a bizarre thing about what is necessary and what isn't. Robin Hobb has a fantastic short story written in the sort of epistolary style. It's a series of diary entries.
Nice.
About the formation of Bingtown.
Oh, cool. It
is a brilliant short story.
I guess I will never actually get it because I have no idea where to find that.
I can't remember which book it's in. I have a collection where it is.
Okay.
In which it occurs.
Yeah.
But is that short story essential for your understanding of the realm of the Elderlings? The major movements of the realm of the Elderlings? You go, no, it's not. It's not essential. Does it add amazing depth and world building? Does it tell you something about the characters? Does it explain something about the role of Bingtown and why it is the way that it is? You go, yes, it does. It's brilliant. And if you're really interested in the realm of the Elderlings, maybe you should read that one,
Yeah.
But is it essential for the main series? No, it's not. It's additional, it's ancillary, it's value added. Just like with say Joe Abercrombie's novels, he has a collection of short stories. Yeah. Are those short stories essential to the understanding of the First Law universe? They're not essential to understanding. They add depth, they add some background information, they flesh out other storylines, they introduce some cool ideas.
Yeah.
They explore different, they are value added. And it may address questions that got raised in the books that are not fully answered in the books. And you go, that's all well and good, but they're not essential to the understanding of the narrative. You don't finish all of the First Law books and go, I really don't know what happened. Oh, I've read this short story. Now I know what happened in those books. And that's the difference. With that short story in Dresden, if you read it, you'd go, oh, well, that addresses that thing. But that short story is not necessary for your understanding of the novel.
No, of course not.
So that would be a distinction I would make. It's yeah, you're perfectly right to say this thing isn't addressed, because it isn't. It's not addressed in the novel, and it's addressed in a short story. But you could then get into a discussion about whether or not, okay, even though it's addressed in a short story, maybe Butcher should have had a couple of paragraphs in the novel.
Yeah.
And here's an interesting question. When were the short stories written?
I have no idea. I didn't check. I know it's in one of the short story collections, and I have those short story collections. I'm going to read them at some point, but I'm currently not the kind of person who goes and digs into when in publication order and also in like in-word chronology they actually take place. But that's exactly what I was wondering. It's like, did he realize after writing book 11 that maybe he should have addressed it and then went back and wrote a short story about it? Or did he write the short story between books in publication order between 10 and 11? That would be like an interesting aspect to it.
And that is something that crops up. So if we look at, again, taking the Wheel of Time as an example, the prequel, is the prequel necessary for understanding the Wheel of Time? No, it's not. You can read the whole of the Wheel of Time without reading New Spring and you're fine. Does it?
But you know, because I haven't yet bought that one.
Does it add a huge amount to the story? Well, it adds a little. Basically, it doesn't add a huge amount. So it's not essential. But also, when are you meant to read it? Are you meant to read New Spring before you start Eye of the World? Well, that's not how it was written. That's not how it was conceived. And that's not when it was written. Are you meant to read it in publication order when it came out? Well, it's a prequel. A prequel can be read ideally, basically, after you've finished the whole series.
I would say, yeah, that's how I tend to read stuff. I usually say read in publication order. It's always the best way to do it. There's exceptions to that. And I would say read, so this is why I will not read New Spring. So I would say ideally, in this case, if I'm not doing publication order, I would say I'll read The Wheel of Time all the way to the end. And then if I ever do a reread, that's when I read New Spring before Eye of the World, because then I have all the background and whatnot, and then I can appreciate it. And when I'm then going to read all those books again, which I'll hopefully never do, then I can actually profit from what I've learned in New Spring. That's how I would do it, I guess. And
for completionists, obviously reading New Spring is essential because it's more information about the world that they want to spend time in. That's absolutely fine. Is it essential for understanding the story? No. No,
that's good to know.
Not essential in the slightest. But prequels are strange because by definition, obviously, they're not part of the main series. So anyone who just says that, oh, that's part of the series, you go, it's not part of the series, it's a prequel to the series. Right? The English gives it away. When you have additional books and sort of spin-off material, and we see this with, say, Doctor Who, where the Doctor Who annual of X did a whole article about this thing and that became canon, or then there were these novels that explored this thing and that's now canon. When you have interviews or say the author publishing their notes, and this is something that is absolutely fascinating because an author publishes their notes about stuff that maybe didn't go into the novels, things that got excised, either during their writing or during editing or during whatever sort of part of the process, but stuff got cut away.
Yeah.
And it never made it in, but it's in their notes. And then their notes get published. We get to see what's going on there. And suddenly it's like, oh, they always intended X to be this thing. And then you get into, well, is it part of continuity? Is it part of the world? Because it's in the notes about this. It's never addressed in the books because that passage got excised.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point you're raising there. And I want to go back to like put a pin in there. It's like the word canon is super fascinating for me in that regard.
Why? Because it's usually misspelled.
Um, no, because I've done a lot of church history. The idea that there is, because what canon implies is that there is a deciding a body of men or a body of people that has the right to decide what is official and what is not. And canon is never just the author saying this is what I want or not, but it's someone else, and that suddenly gives people, usually fandoms or whatever, that point where they're like, yeah, we have a right to actually intrude on the creation of the artist and decide what is part of that continuity and what is not. Now, with Star Wars, it's fascinating because it's obviously a company that decides that kind of stuff. With other people, it's literally the fandom, sort of, especially if the artist is either not communicating or is dead. So that idea of canon being something outside of whatever is published is super fascinating to me.
And it's an odd one as well, because sometimes you will find an author who in a subsequent novel does something and the fans go, that's a retcon, they're going against their own canon. It's the author's world. And I think part of this can be traced to our favorite death of the author argument.
Yeah.
That by reducing the importance of authorial intent and elevating the importance of reader perception and reader meaning, that it's destabilized this notion of what is authoritative about a text. And then we get this sort of democratized version of what the canon is, the understanding of the text, the accepted reading and what is part of the world. And then you have authors and artists and creators who decide to go back and tinker with things. Lucas is a perfect example, retconning, changing aspects of Star Wars: A New Hope.
We just have to talk about the who shot first question, right?
But Han shooting second fundamentally changes Han's arc, because now he isn't the same rogue.
Yes.
Han shooting first establishes him as a rogue, establishes him as slightly immoral.
Yes.
And that gives him a heroic arc, so that at the end, when he swoops in against his own interests to rescue Luke,
he has changed.
That's the heroic arc, making him kind of, he was always kind of good from the very beginning, removes a lot of that arc, that now he's just slightly inept, and it does a lot of damage to the character. But for a family film, where you're trying to show children a good role model, you can understand why you would want Han to be seen as less morally ambiguous at the beginning. Yeah. And it all depends on what you're trying to do with the narrative, what you mean with the narrative, the intentionality behind it. So I can understand why Lucas changed it. I just think it's a bad change, because I think it works better the other way.
Definitely.
But I'm of that generation that will always feel that way.
Yeah, but I mean, the question then is, what is, to use the word again, canon? Is like officially, obviously, what Hasbro says, or whoever. No, Disney owns that stuff right now. Whoever owns it's like whoever, they obviously say that like Han, but like if Lucas says that Han shot second, does that make that the correct and official version? And you're like, I liked it better the other way. And is the fact that you remember seeing the movie when Han was still shooting first, does that make you someone who's like sort of part of like a different reality? Because in your world, it was true at some point. And now it's not. I find it's fascinating, especially with Star Wars, because he changed it, and all the like copies of the movie at this point are like the other way around. And the people that actually remember seeing, like outside of the internet with like clips and whatnot, the people that actually remember it the other way around are slowly dying out.
Well, one of the things that I own a collector's edition of the Star Wars original trilogy, where you have the DVDs of the cinematic release and the DVDs of the digitally improved versions.
Now
I
you
own
have
both.
to be very, very careful unless like the George Lucas thought police storms your apartment and takes away those things because they are banned
They sold them
narratives.
to me.
Well, they will sell
I,
everything to you if possible.
But I also own multiple versions of Blade Runner.
Mm-hmm.
Because
that's the
again,
same thing. I would say there the director's cut is definitely improving on that like cinematic release.
But yeah, the cinematic release, the director's cut, which was unauthorized and had nothing to do with Scott. And then you had a different version. And then you had like a definitive. I think there's like 4 versions of Blade.
Yeah, I own that one as well. Yes, exactly. Now, which one is the definitive one? I mean, it says definitive, but then again, like what's his name, Francis Ford Coppola actually releases another definitive version of
The Godfather. Anytime he needs a check.
Yeah, or Apocalypse Now. He does it with both.
But and again, it's sometimes this is just playing in the margins. That it's not fundamentally altering the narrative. And again, this is what we kind of come back to again.
Yeah.
That when something is a relatively minor change, even hand shooting first or hand shooting second, does not definitively alter the main narrative of Star Wars. It is playing in the margins. It has a significant impact on Han's story arc, but ultimately the events all play out the same way. Han is roughly the same character all the way through, and it all plays out that way. So is it a massive change? Not really.
No.
I
would argue most people would probably not even notice unless you explain, because those 2 shots still happen so close together, because unless you really pay attention, you're probably just like, oh, both shoot, someone's dead.
And also it makes Greedo a really bad shot, because it
True.
just goes off at a really weird angle. But it's a bit like someone saying about Star Wars, like, oh, you need to know about Cy Snootles and the Max Rebo Band and the whole story that they had in that collection of short stories. You know, why does anyone need to know about Cy Snootles and the Max Rebo Band who played at Jabba's palace? They don't. That's not important to the events of Return of the Jedi. But there is a short story about them.
Oh, that sounds like a bit of Star Wars that I might actually want to read at some point.
So it's fascinating because how we construct narrative, what we view as important, and how we build it. And to go back to Death of the Author, so much of this resides in the individual reader. And what we bring in terms of the information we use to interpret narrative and to restructure it and to give it meaning, that is going to be highly personal. And what you generally find is across a broad enough population and set of readers that there is a general view of what the narrative is about. And then there'll be outliers and, just standard distribution graph kind of stuff. And that's kind of what we do. Look at the number of people we talk about in poetry readings. Like this is the accepted reading. This is a popular reading of the poem. Here's a sort of minor reading of the poem. Think about it in judicial opinion. Here's the majority opinion. Here's a minority opinion. Some of which may be the same. Some of which may be wildly different. That the idea of it has to be a fixed reality. It has to be fixed in canon. This encyclopedic impulse to write everything down and it cannot deviate from this is a very, well, I would think is a fairly new phenomenon, and it is not something that I generally would approach literature with. I think literature is very flexible, and it always has had fuzzy margins. It's always had gray areas and murky depths to it, where these spaces in which a reader can inhabit and create new meaning, that very rarely is a text entirely fixed. The major points might be fixed, but there's usually a lot of flexibility in narrative.
Yeah. See, that's sort of where I want to go. You said like the individual reader. Would you say that through and something I've been thinking about a lot. It's like through the advent of the internet and social media in particular and stuff like that, we at this point also have what you might call the collective reader, because fandoms kind of sort of gravitate towards specific readings and whatnot. And then you have all these like social dynamics when people are ousted for believing something else. And I remember back in the day, because I grew up with like, my family was like not exactly early adopters when it came to computer technology. So I grew up with like, my group of friends had a specific reading or interpretation of a specific movie or a specific book. And it's like, we kind of hashed that out amongst each other. We argued about it, and, you know, being boys and kids, we probably also got into a fight about it, maybe went physical or not. And then we all agreed that this is how it was supposed to be. And now suddenly we have like the possibility of like getting into fistfights on the internet with people from like entirely different continents. And that adds like a whole lot more weight, because there's that economic aspect to it, right? When me and my 5 friends decide to not support that change in the canon of whatever series it was all about, the big publishing company will just like shrug and say, yeah, we don't care. But if the entire internet starts like to talk about like, and suddenly the entire like so-called fandom goes in like a direction that is different from what the intellectual property is actually going towards, that suddenly adds a lot of weight. And then you come to like something that has, you know, I guess technically was there ever since, Arthur Conan Doyle had to revive Sherlock Holmes, but it's sort of like the same thing, only more so at this point.
Well, it's weird. The whole restore the Snyderverse movement, the whole Justice League, Snyderverse thing. On the one hand, it's really cool that fans getting together and they got a new form of the story told. You go, that's really cool. Let's, collective bargaining in action. That's the basis of unions. Get the workers united and we can have a change. And they took something that they were dissatisfied with and they campaigned and they got a new version. You go, that, in one respect, that's fantastic. In the other respect, I think it is one of the worst things that has ever happened in the history of the internet, because now it's created an expectation of, I don't like this, I want you to remake it the way that I want.
And that's like, who is the fucking artist in this point? Do I get to decide how the piece of art that I'm consuming goes or not? It's like, how, like, if I complain to Steven Erickson and send him an email, it's like, you know what? I don't like how the Malazan Book of the Fallen ends. I want it to end differently. And he goes and writes that, because I'm not the only one who does that. Does it still have the same impact? Or is it like because I basically decide how the story goes and not the artist? Is that still like art appreciation? Or is it more like I pay someone to make my dreams come true, basically?
I mean, if you have the money, I'm sure you could hire an author and go, can you rewrite the end chapter of that book for me and give me?
I'm pretty sure
quite a lot of authors would take you up on that for a certain sum. But
it might not even be that much money at this point, I guess.
But the thing with the Justice League, and yeah, Zack Snyder's version of Justice League works as a better narrative, but it's a worse film. And the reason I say that is, it's over 4 hours long.
Yeah.
And you go, he was asked to create a film. If it needs to be 4 hours long in order to work, then that's a bad film, because it had to be shown in a cinema. And you can't have over 4 hours as, oh, well, here you go. That's not what he was asked to create.
Well, I've watched Gone with the Wind in a cinema.
Well, that's back when we had the little breaks in between.
And the racism and all the other, well, we still do have the racism, but
but so on the one hand, it was great to get this, and it's a very interesting version of the story, but there's a whole load of stuff in it you could look at and go, you don't need that, you don't need that, you don't need that, and you could actually cut it all back down again. But it was padded out. But now it's created an expectation that if we complain loud enough and there are enough of us, we'll get our way. So you suddenly have narrative by committee. And when was the last time that narrative by committee worked? because when you think about it, they campaigned for Justice League, but it was still Zack Snyder's vision. It was a relatively singular vision, Zack Snyder and his design team and what they came up with.
Yeah.
But now it's, well, I don't like that. We saw this with the Wheel of Time TV show. I don't like the creative team behind the Wheel of Time. Sack them, put in a new team, and just redo the whole thing. As if this is in any way viable or even necessary, just because someone doesn't like how they're approaching it. That it's created a level of entitlement amongst fans that they can dictate as to what they want. The availability of authors and creatives on Twitter and social media, that you now can have this dialogue with the creators of the things that you love. And that is such a wonderful opportunity. Because I think back when I was studying literature, if we'd had the opportunity to talk to Shakespeare about his plays, to get some insight into what he was doing instead of constantly trying to guess, to talk to Arthur Conan Doyle about Sherlock Holmes. And we have a whole lot of his letters. We have some of his papers where he talked about aspects of this. And that's why we know that he was under intense pressure to bring Holmes back and didn't want to. But with that accessibility, instead of looking at it as a privilege, we're now getting to the stage where we look at it as a right. And we look at it as our due, that yes, of course we should be able to tell the author exactly what we want. And not everyone does this, but you can understand why authors shun social media, because they come under attacks. They can't have personal opinions anymore, because if they have a personal opinion about something, it is guaranteed to please some people, but not others. So either they issue bland, generic statements about something that are absolutely meaningless, or they run the risk of being yelled at by one segment of the population and venerated by another.
Yeah, or they polarize from the beginning. It's like, if you're always known, recently spoke with a friend about that. It's like about from the music side of things, where you have the same issue, obviously. There's one band that we talked about, and it's like they've always been very, very outspoken, radical. I would call them leftists, but progressive, the American spectrum. They've always been that way, even before anyone cared about it. So they can get away with having strong opinions because their entire fan base has been about that all the time. And it's a radical, like almost like liking the band and being conservative is, for most, like vocally conservative, which I would call right wing, just doesn't work because it's like fundamentally not part of your worldview. So radical like opinions would also work when it comes to like opinions, because it's part of your, so to speak, brand, right? It's like, this is like a lefty author or a right wing author or whatever. And then you can do that, but then you also have to play to that crowd, because if that group of musicians would suddenly espouse one specific view that is, not part of that specific bubble, so to speak, they would have a lot of problems. So it also kind of comes back to what you said. It's like, you can't actually have your own personal narrative, opinion. You have to stay within a specific narrative of opinions, I guess.
But and then we have if an author expresses an opinion on something, well, they were very rude about that. Well, why are they not entitled to be just as rude as their commenters? Because like you and I have seen this on our YouTube videos. Some people are very rude. Yeah, that they are. The majority of people aren't. And maybe some of these people don't intend to be rude. They don't realize that they're being rude, but some of them very most definitely do. So
funny story. Funny story.
Okay, go ahead. You tell your story.
Funny stories about that. I got like one real hate comment once on a video I made on Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and someone was complaining about me drinking beer while talking about Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, and talking about like how Fafhrd and Grey Mouser would totally slay me while I get drunk. And I'm like, have you ever read those stories? Because I'm pretty sure they would just like sit down and have a beer with me at that point. I mean, there's no fantasy story that's more about like everyday alcoholism than Fafhrd and Grey Mouser.
But my point on this was, and I have a little YouTube channel, but someone's really rude to me. Why do I have to be polite back? Why do they get to be rude to me, but I have to be polite back? Because if I'm rude to them back, it'd be, well, AP was very rude in that comment.
Yeah.
But why not? Why? Oh, because it's my channel. And you go, well, okay, fine, I'll just delete stuff then. But there's an expectation that the other person has to behave, but you don't. And when you multiply this to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, and when you suddenly have hundreds of commenters sending emails or comments that are rude or abusive, how much is an author expected to put up with? Oh, well, they chose to be a public figure. No, they chose to write books.
Yes.
Oh, but they chose to be on social media. No, we forced them onto social media because that's how modern publishing works. They are told they have to have a media profile, that they are to interact with fans. Oh, but they interacted the wrong way. And the unwritten rules and the unwritten social mores of interaction. And people go, oh, but it's very clear. And you go, in your culture and in your part of the internet, in your part of the world.
Yes.
But the big thing about the internet is it's everywhere. And you're in Germany. I'm in Ireland. There are cultural differences. There are some things we generally agree on, but the exact line defining things is going to be different. And then we can go across the Atlantic and we go to America. But again, America is not homogenous. Or we go to Canada and Canada is not homogenous. That it gets very complicated. And there are no written contracts. There are no rules. And the internet evolves so quickly and has evolved so quickly. In the last 20 years, look at how the media landscape has changed.
Very much, yeah. I mean,
and for someone who's been using it, say, growing up with it, and they've been there at the forefront, they go, oh, yes, but it's obvious. And you go, but you've been there with every single change. But look back at how it used to be and look at where you are now.
Yeah.
And you go, for other people who are not doing that all day, every day, who have not been part of it all day, every day, do you not see that this is weird? This is different. It's difficult.
Yeah, that's, I mean, the fact that how the internet has changed, and how the advent of the internet has changed societies as a whole and discourse as a whole is insanely interesting to watch. As I feel like you and me are like people that are lucky in a way, because we have like sort of memories from before the internet.
The before times.
Also, yeah, but we're also not too, like, I mean, we might struggle with parts of like internet culture, but we're not that far gone yet that we're just like sitting in front of it and don't understand it. So we can actually see it change and are yet like, you know, able to just observe it and not just get angry at it for like existing in a way.
But I'm always going to be a grumpy old man who's going to be sitting on his porch going, get off my lawn. I mean, that's just me. But
true.
What's weird is the life cycle of a meme. If you think going back 10 years when stuff happened, what was that one? The World of Warcraft one about Leroy Jenkins. Like that was around for about 3 years. Now you're lucky if a meme lasts 3 weeks.
Yeah.
That they cycle through so quickly, there's an acceleration of pace. And if someone says, oh, but it's clear that everyone should know that, you go, no. I took a hiatus for 3 weeks. Memes could have risen, become hugely popular, and died in that time. When I was away.
That's the things. Like I go offline on a Friday. I go to, because I back in the days when we had like festivals and stuff and not the plague. It's like I go to like a rock festival. It starts on like a Thursday. I come back on Monday, or Sunday, and then I sober up on Monday, and I switch on my computer on Tuesday, and an entire cycle of meme has happened. And I've like, no, I was busy getting drunk at the time.
So, I mean, social media has changed radically.
Yes.
The media landscape itself has changed radically. Our interaction with artists and creators and authors and writers has changed dramatically.
Yes.
Our interaction with other fans has changed dramatically. The accessibility of different media formats, be it audiobooks, written books, comic books, graphic novels, computer games, animated shorts. I mean, if you're a Star Trek fan, do you have to have watched the original Star Trek cartoon? Because there was one season of the Star Trek cartoon.
I did not even
Kirk
know
and
that
Spock.
existed, but now I have to find it.
If you're a Star Trek fan, you have to watch every single TV sort of episode. In addition to then, what about all of the different books? Do they count? What about the comic books? But the crossover episode of the X-Men and Star Trek, do you need to know that one as a Star Trek fan in order to understand, oh, well, that's non-canonical, that's a what-if story? You know, all of these things play into it, that there's now such a vast collection of stuff. And because of the internet, because things get archived now, because things are easier to retrieve and gain access to, that a limited edition comic that was only published for a like one-off event, say a Star Trek convention in Vegas, and they published one story in this comic book, that someone scans that and now suddenly everyone has access to it. Does that become part of mainstream canon? Was that always something on the side?
Yeah.
These things have radically changed how we understand story, how we approach story. And the repercussions of it are not going to be fully understood for generations. Like it's only with hindsight can we contextualize things. But certainly our approach to how quickly information is fed to us as readers has changed dramatically. Our need for instant gratification has accelerated and become far more dominant. Our ability to delay gratification has substantially weakened. Our need to have things explained very directly and explicitly has seemingly increased. And if these needs are not met, we become very vocal about it.
I mean, that's sort of like the thing where, like, one of the aspects, and like when it comes to like collectively voicing our disagreement or whatever you want to call it, right? It has definitely, what I find interesting about that is how capitalism has changed. We are not only out there and like saying, now, I don't want that. We are actively, like, people in general, like, this is like the big we, basically, right? We're like calling for like change, and we're like, otherwise we will boycott. We're actually engaging with it on an economic scale, and it's sort of the weird, it kind of drags down, I guess, in a way, or at least finally frames it correctly, that art is also, production of goods or commodities in some form or other. And that idea that we had, like, for a long time, that you still have in like these, like, sort of like elitist, like, upper class circles, like the artist is like this individual that like works in this bubble and does whatever I was going to say he, because usually in that specific class, artists are male most of the time. They're doing their own thing and they don't care about the world outside. That has sort of died out, because no, that is still part of like an economy. It's the art economy or the publishing industry or whatever you want to call it. And consumers have power in that thing as well.
But the expression "a room of one's own," like Virginia Woolf pointed this out, unless someone is independently wealthy, market forces are going to have a certain impact on the creation of your art and the commodification of your art.
Yes.
Either you take a job so that you can keep a roof over your head and you do your art in your spare time.
Yes.
Because that's your passion, that's what you want to do. But you still need to eat, you still need a roof over your head.
Yeah.
But if you're independently wealthy, you can sit around, you can construct a garret and go and sit in it, and with a fountain pen go and create things. But I think the majority of the majority of authors, they write their books to the best of their ability, and they hope that those books find an audience.
Yeah.
Obviously, some authors write to what they think and expect the audience will want. And that's a different way. They're writing to a market. And you go, well, that's another artistic choice that is taking, the market forces at a higher level than, say, someone who's hoping to find an audience.
Yeah, and that's part of like what you have, right? It's like if you write your first book, I guess, like, it's the same with like musicians. It's like you start out, you create your first piece of art, and you put all your heart and soul into it, and you get lucky and it gets published, and it gets like sort of successful, and suddenly you have to make that choice of, do I do this like full time, so to speak? Do I make this like my vocation and my job? Like, do I make this my job? And suddenly you have to deal with those market forces from that point on. And you can either hope or you can try to meet some expectations.
And it's always difficult. I mean, one of the things I admire about Eriksson's Malazan Book of the Fallen and Esselmann's Novels of the Malazan Empire, every single one of those books is different.
Yeah.
They both play with narrative structures, they play with points of view, they play with themes, they play with settings, they play with different characters. Yeah. That you don't go, oh, this book is the same as that one. But in other series, and Dresden Files is a good example of this, every book is slightly different, but there are certain structures that run through it. There are certain characters that always run through it. There are certain morals and plot lines that run through it.
Yes,
that
it's like I'm always counting at which page Harry Dresden first looks at someone's nipple piercings, because it happens every single book.
Let's not get into that. But when you pick up a Harry Dresden book by Jim Butcher, yeah, you basically know what you are getting.
Yeah,
like you can predict it's going to basically follow a. No, he gets better at disguising it, and they do have individuality. I'm not saying they're all carbon copies.
No, of course
you
not.
know what you are getting. But picking up a Malazan Book of the Fallen, if you picked up Gardens of the Moon, do you think that any of the other books are like Gardens of the Moon? You're like, well, not really. But each one is quite different to the others and does different things. But we see this with, say, Dan Brown. Dan Brown has one style of writing, and turns out lots of books basically around the same sort of paradigm, the same sort of structures. We see it with the Tom Clancy books. Yeah. They all follow Robert Ludlum's Bourne books, which actually were quite different to the films, because Jason Bourne was much older.
I've never watched the movies, and I have not read the books either.
Or Dick Francis writing all of those sort of jockey-focused mystery novel, sort of detective novel thing.
Yeah, and even if you go back, like with like, to bring it back into the fantasy area, like, you pick up a Conan story, and you can tell with those Conan stories, well, Robert E. Howard, you can tell when he's writing for his audience and when he's writing for himself, because he's either currently in a situation where he has enough money or he just doesn't care. But you can tell he knows, he's aware of what people expect from his story, and he follows that kind of thing to the T, basically.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that as a choice.
True.
Is it my preference to always have, like, David Eddings was a classic example of this. David Eddings wrote 5 books that all follow the same basic structure. And then he wrote the next 5 books, which repeated the first 5. And then he wrote a trilogy, which basically repeated the first 5. And then he wrote a second trilogy, which repeated the first trilogy. And, it's exactly the same thing over and over again with the same characters. Yeah. David Gemmell has a lot of very similar characters going through similar adventures in each of his books. Yeah. But again, there was enough variation that it felt new, it felt fun, it felt interesting. It was enough to keep you going. There's room on every bookcase for multiple styles of narrative.
Yeah, of course.
If you were reading, to return to your original point, if you were reading the Draenei books, and you have, in the original sort of Draenei saga, there were 3 books. There was Legend, Waylander, and The King Beyond the Gate. Yeah. And there are massive time jumps between the books where weird things happen. Yeah. And then other books have come in and kind of tried to fill in stuff, and they're written after the fact. So you can read them chronologically, or you can read them in publication order, or you can read them almost in any order. It doesn't actually make a lot of difference. Yeah. They're all self-contained narratives. Yeah. But in order to understand the story of Waylander, do you need any of the other books?
No.
Because in the first book, Waylander, there is enough there for you to understand the character of Waylander. If it is entirely conditional upon in order to understand the central character of this book, you have to have read all of these other books. That would be something you go, well, hang on, is that a weakness of the story?
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean it's this story's bad, but you can identify it as a weakness because it wasn't intended when it was published to be part of Waylander 1, 2, and 3. That's not how Gemmell envisaged it. Because Waylander was popular, he went on and wrote other books with Waylander in them. That's different.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting one because there is no fixed answer. There is no right or wrong because, books are not written in a vacuum. Stories are not created in a vacuum.
There's like two things there's like one what I really find fascinating, just like a small like aside, is like obviously I listen to audiobooks, so I hang out on, or I buy my books on Audible sometimes. And Audible does like sort books when you search for like an author or whatever. They put them in, they have like these small, like put them into like series and stuff. And with stuff like David Gemmell or Discworld, they have like, this is part of this series, this series, this series, and this series. And you have the same Draenei book show up in like publication order, it's number X. In the Druss Chronicles, it's number Y. And this other series, it's this number, and it's just fascinating to see that, and it always confuses me. But what I actually wanted to look at question is how we changed from looking at, this is probably mostly a fantasy and sci-fi thing, although I guess horror and real world, sort of horror placed at least sort of in our world, kind of comes into that with the into the multiverse stuff of the multiverse of Stephen King, with the idea that at some point we start thinking of these things as fictional worlds and no longer as individual stories, right? It's like we're no longer saying like Star Wars is those 3 films, but Star Wars is that entire weird universe. And when we say Lord of the Rings nowadays, we don't mean, the Fellowship, the Two Towers, the Return of the King. We sort of mean all of Middle Earth, sort of, except the parts that we haven't read or whatever. But that's sort of, at some point in like recent history, I feel it changed, and we started thinking of it as fictional worlds and no longer as individual stories.
Yeah, but like here's a weird one. Terry Pratchett's Discworld.
Yes.
Terry Pratchett's Discworld is set in a secondary world, and it's fantastical, and it's an entire series of books.
Yes.
No one reads Discworld on the expectation that I'm reading this book and the next book is going to follow on in the sequence and with the same characters. No one has that expectation.
But they do at this point. That's the weird bit. At this point, when you, and I've been a huge Terry Pratchett fan forever, and I've read most of those books like more than 10 times at this point. But the interesting thing is when you go on, say, BookTube or whatever, and people are like, yeah, you want to start with Guards and continue and read the Guards series, and then you want to go and read the Witches series or whatever. They don't read it in publication order anymore. They expect, or like they say it's a better reading experience if you go and read specific sub-series one after the other. So they kind of change that with Discworld.
So they create like a subset, like the City Watch books or the Witches books.
Exactly.
But when you're looking at it, when you look at the whole of Discworld and you go, what is it, like 47 novels or something?
41 or 42, I think.
I don't know. 42 would be a good one. Answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. But because Discworld is fantastic. But when you look at the whole of Discworld, yes, there are mini arcs within it, and there are all of these different sort of things. But you don't pick up the whole series and you read, if you're reading through in publication order, and go, this isn't a good series because that character doesn't appear in this book. And yet, for some reason, when someone writes a fantasy series, there's an expectation that it's going to be a single narrative following a single set of characters.
I blame Tolkien.
But when authors deviate from that, they get so punished. Look at the reaction to, regardless of what you think of Peter V. Brett's series, the Warded Man.
The Demon War Cycle, whatever. Yeah, that one.
Demon War Cycle.
I have not read that one. Should I?
That's a different thing. But in that, there was as the books went on, then one of the books essentially sort of went back in time to look at the events, but from a different character's perspective leading up to that. And it was, well, why didn't the story just carry on? And you go, but this is actually really interesting. And then it did it again, but from a different character's perspective.
That sounds like a really cool thing. Maybe I should read just for the structural stuff.
And people got very, very frustrated with that. And I am not saying that there aren't problems with this series, but you know, I have problems with every series that I read because I'm just mean. But the structural aspect of that, of telling the story from different perspectives and how that figures into why they did the various things that they did, was actually really interesting to me. It was something I loved. But a lot of the fans hated it and were very vocal about their hate.
Yeah.
And you go, but that's not the problem with the series. That structural choice wasn't an issue. Well, for me at least. But for a lot of people, it was wrong because it wasn't carrying on the story. The story wasn't moving forward.
Yeah.
As if forward momentum in a story is the only thing.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of you have to get to the end. How many times have you heard, is the payoff worth it? You go, why are you reading something that you don't enjoy? Read it. There is a cliche, the journey, not the destination. I know it is a cliche, but when you're reading something that is well written, and I'm not just talking about, oh, it's written in exquisite prose. When it is well written, when there are interesting characters, when the prose on the page is beautiful, when it is evoking thought and theme and challenging concepts, you read. That is one of the reasons why you can read, and you can read along with that. And sure, narrative events concluding in a big cataclysm, that can be fantastic. And if that's what you're looking for, go forth. There are thousands of books written that way.
Yeah.
But to define all narrative as, oh, well, is the payoff worth it? As if the payoff is the only thing. You go,
there's the same things like death is apparently not, you know, death is meaningless because people come back from the dead. It's like, what kind of weird mindset is that you expect people, like, everything to have some sort of, you apply some sort of cost benefit analysis. Like, yeah, I felt bad because character X died, so if he comes back, that invalidates my grief in that situation, so I hate it for that. It's like, that's a weird outlook for these kind of things. And what you say, like, is the payoff worth it? Yeah, exactly. It's like the general idea that you're reading for some very specific aspect is generally, and other people telling you if that's not your like way of reading, will then maybe just do something else, is just weird.
But the character death thing is interesting because fake out deaths. And we've gotten very used to this in a lot of different media formats. But a fake out death where that character's totally dead, and then ta-da, no, they're not. And, you know, there's only a certain number of times when it is done badly that you can go to that well.
Yeah.
But if you have constructed a reality in which, you know, people are moving backwards and forwards to the afterlife. Look at the TV show Supernatural. Like, people died and came back in that show all the time. But some of the characters, when they died, stayed dead. There was no guarantee that when a character died, they would come back.
Yeah.
But then sometimes the characters who had died were not coming back, but in an episode, they were in a metaphysical reality and they got to speak to the ghost of that character. The character's still dead. They're not coming back, but there was an interaction with them. It doesn't rob the scene from 3 seasons prior where they had died of meaning, because the character died. The other characters went through grief. It's difficult because fake out deaths cheapen, for some people, death, because you then never know if a character is coming back. And I can understand that. It destabilizes the notion and trust in the author.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between a fake out death and when, particularly in fantasy, where metaphysics of the reality of the secondary world allow for various forms of reincarnation or communication with the spirit world or any of these things.
Yeah. That's when like death becomes transformational. It's a transformation. It's not, the end. Now, it was super fascinating when I was complaining about something about Wheel of Time, because I'm complaining about Wheel of Time a lot these days. And I know people are telling me, just stop reading it because apparently I'm not enjoying it. It's like, I'm not reading this to, fall in love with the characters. That's not why I'm reading books. It's other things that I want to find out about these things. And that may make me annoyed, but it's like the idea that someone else tells you that you're reading for enjoyment, and enjoyment has to be your job is to cheer on the characters all the time. That's not how reading works. That's not how art appreciation in general works. You're not supposed to love everything or just like be positively euphoric about it in a way.
But also, even if you aren't enjoying the Wheel of Time, you might go, well, the Wheel of Time, because it is so well loved, because it is formative for a particular type of fantasy at a particular time, it's an important text. Yes. I should read this. And I have problems with it as I am reading it. And, I'm going to talk about them because I have a YouTube channel. Yeah. That's perfectly valid. Like, read it because you want to find out why it was important to other people. Yeah. That's a perfectly valid reason for reading. It's an important text. I want to learn more about the genre. There's a valid reason for reading. Yeah. To say that reading, particularly for fantasy, is only for enjoyment and leisure is, I did a PhD in the subject. Do you think I enjoyed every single book I read for my PhD?
I don't know. Did you have to read Wizard's First Rule for that one?
Yes.
Oh God.
I read quite a few of that series.
Yeah.
It was an important fantasy series at the time.
Yeah, right.
But there were a lot of books that I read and didn't enjoy, but they were revelatory about aspects of the genre.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that I have read them because it gives me a broader view of the genre at that point in time.
Yeah. So what I said earlier is like, with Wheel of Time or other books, is like there's things that I want to have read or movies that I want to have watched. I watched Gone with the Wind. Do I want to do this again? Hell no, it was terrible. The entire 4 hours were fucking terrible. But it's something that I feel I should have watched at some point because, it gives me, it helps with my general perspective on life, the universe, and everything, so to speak.
Well, also, if you're watching Gone with the Wind, when Scarlett O'Hara's dad comes in, Scarlett, how are you? And it's in my head every time I go, you'll never get your hands on me Lucky Charms. Every single time, and that's it. And it's interesting. Like people talk about you should keep politics out of art, out of film, out of television, out of fantasy, out of science fiction.
It's stupid. Every piece of art in general is political by definition.
And I feel much the same way, because if usually we notice the politics in something when it disagrees with or is not that our politics is not in full agreement with it.
Yeah.
If it ruffles or brushes against our politics, that's when we notice it. When we don't notice it, it's usually because the politics of the novel is not disagreeing with our politics.
Yeah.
But for some people, the inclusion of gay characters will be seen as a political act. And, that's diversity and the progressive agenda. For other people, it's like, well, I know a bunch of gay people. Why shouldn't they be in my novel?
Exactly.
It's perfectly normal. For some people, the inclusion of different skin tones. It's diversity and progressive politics run amok. For other people, it's like, have you seen my street where I live?
Yeah.
For some people, strong female character. They're ruining this franchise because it's focused on the women. And other people are like, well, we have 30 books in this franchise that are all focused on men. Can we not have 2 that are focused on women? Like, what's the bit? It's not ruining the franchise.
Yeah.
But For some people, those things will be massive because it rubs up against their personal politics in one way. For other people, they don't notice it at all because it doesn't bother them. And it's not political. So you will always have one person saying, this is really political, and the other people going, but this isn't political. Look at Tolkien's work.
Tolkien's work, I was just going to bring it up, right? It's like, I reread Lord of the Rings again last year. It's like, don't get me wrong, I love Tolkien. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. I appreciate a lot of the stuff that he does, but holy shit, is Lord of the Rings, in particular, the Fellowship of the Ring, is a classist book as fuck. And later on in the Two Towers, right? Why do all the orcs have working class accents? And I'm not saying like how the narrator in the audiobooks write it, but like how he's writing them,
because they're illiterate, they're not smart, they're dumb.
Therefore, they're the working
class.
And you know, of course, that is a political book in that regard, because Tolkien's politics,
small c conservative.
Yeah.
But and he's writing about a time period in which there was a very stratified class structure. Yeah. He's writing about like his experience of the war, where you had the young gentleman officers and their working class Batman. You know, so
or Sam Gamgee,
Sam Gamgee to Frodo, the young noble officer, who's gone off with his mates on a bit of a jaunt to show the enemy the back of his boot heel or something.
Yeah, to show Johnny Sauron what. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I got to go and show Johnny Sauron the back of my hand. We'll teach him a jolly good lesson. You know, you can see a lot of that in it. The idyll of the slightly conservative rural agrarian shire, but it's full of that slightly xenophobic English. Those people from that village across there, I don't trust them. You know, it's that very small c conservative, very, and you know, we would describe it heteronormative, that very few women in it. Is it misogynist, or is it just more centered on men? But all of those things are aspects of Tolkien's storytelling that if you have that as kind of your base politics, you don't notice. If your politics are slightly different, you start noticing them. Or if you're trained or expect to look for these things, where you apply a feminist lens and you go through it and go, how many female characters are in the whole of the Lord of the Rings?
2.
How many lines of dialogue do they have? You know,
3.
When you start picking those things out, you realize it's a conscious choice on Tolkien's part not to include very many female characters.
Yeah.
It is a conscious choice that the female characters he include are done in a certain way. But
yeah, I mean, and that's why Eowyn sticks out so much, because she's not exactly that. And you notice her because it's like, wow. and I think that's like the thing that I find fascinating about Tolkien is like he's reading Lord of the Rings feels like he's almost aware of what he's doing, but only almost.
But then you look at how he describes the Sutherlands and the Easterlings.
Yeah.
And you see that very unconscious racism and xenophobia and Orientalism being applied. Now, that doesn't mean that Tolkien was evil. It doesn't mean that Tolkien was a bad guy. It doesn't mean that Tolkien was out there going, oh, I'm pro-Nazi and I hate all people of color. No, but it was part of the cultural expression of his time. It is a form of politics.
Yeah, that's like the one thing that I always find fascinating when Tolkien gets discussed, like on the internet, for example. Everyone is like, Tolkien is racist because how he treats orcs. It's like, no, Tolkien's racism is in how he treats the Southrons and how the Easterlings. That's where the racism is.
Or what are the pygmy guides in the forest?
The Vodes of the Wood, Han Buri Khan and his gang somewhere at the beginning of Return of the King.
And you sort of go, oh look, English colonial soldier, and here's our local guide. A lot of that creeps in. Now, some people say, well, that's not political. It's a representation of how he believes at the time. And you go, yes, politics. It's the cultural politics of the time.
I guess that's because the term politics has become a political term at this point. Yep. If you say politics, what you mean is like, I don't like this.
and again, when the politics of a narrative, when either we agree with them or they don't challenge our politics, that's when we don't notice them. When the politics of a narrative challenge our politics or disagree with our politics, that's when we notice them. And you know, I saw on Twitter someone saying we shouldn't have politics in fantasy, and you go, congratulations, you've just gotten rid of A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. You've just gotten rid of Dracula by Bram Stoker. You've gotten rid of The Lord of the Rings. You've gotten rid of 95% of science fiction ever written. You've gotten rid of huge swathes of fantasy. Robert E. Howard. You've gotten rid of all of the Conan stories. You've gotten rid of Lovecraft. Like, as soon as you say you shouldn't have, it shouldn't be there, and that is, to be perfectly honest, it's rubbish. There's always going to be politics, whether or not it is done well, whether or not it is integrated into the world, whether or not it is something is being investigated or is snuck in unconsciously. Those are all different questions. But to say it shouldn't be there is denying the fact that it is always going to be there.
I know. It's something that I struggle with, both with the books and especially personally because of the record label and stuff. With the music scene, heavy metal, you have the same thing, because you have we have a right-wing problem in heavy metal. It's huge. We have a lot of misogyny and racism in heavy metal. And the people complaining about heavy metal not being about politics are exactly those people that say, I don't want to be challenged. It's like music, like art in general, at least as soon as you have lyrics in it, will be political, because even if you only write romantic love songs, you're still going to perpetuate a specific ideal of how relationships should work, whatever. This will be political. It is political because it's people using language, and that's where politics start. And to ignore that is just, or willfully, deny that is just wrong.
But I mean, it's a fascinating thing, because genuinely, it's very difficult to think of books that don't have any politics in them. Well, books for adults. Some children's books don't have as obvious political sort of ramifications.
I would
even
argue,
someone had a children's book.
I would argue that both, say, Alice in Wonderland and the one that I always claim is the perfect novel, which is Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh is a political book. It has politics in it.
But and again, sometimes it is difficult to see. But even something like Harry Potter. Harry Potter has a load of politics running all the way through it. Very conservative English politics. And, quite often not particularly feminist politics either. But it runs all the way through the series. And people don't have a problem with that until they do suddenly have a problem with it. But it's always been there. It's been there. Just because you didn't notice it as a child doesn't mean that it wasn't there.
And that's the interesting thing. What you say about Harry Potter is true, and it kind of ties back to where we started this out, because a lot of it kind of happened later on with J.K. Rowling starting to add things to the canon, so to speak, and changing the canon, and thus changing perspectives and whatnot. And obviously also her being, still an active author on the internet, but the whole combination of that.
And we circle back to, when you read a text, you form meaning and intentionality, and you read all of these things in. You pick up a lot on tone, and we see this when we read, say, a statement. If we're just looking at the written text, quite often we imply tone to it. And I've seen this in commentary about, say, an essay that Stephen Erickson has written, and they go, he's so pretentious. And you go, but you've spoken to him, I've spoken to him. He's not a pretentious person.
No.
It's, but he was so out of line there because he shouldn't have done that. And you're like, I'm looking at that and I'm seeing someone be mildly irritated. That's not a major rant. I think everyone's entitled to be mildly irritated. They go, no, but he should have been more polite. That people read into it tone and intentionality. And that's obviously like what we do when we read. But what's weird is when we do it, we tend to look at these things and go, yeah, this is how I've interpreted it. But I'm aware at all times that it is my personal interpretation and there may be others. And what the thing that I think we now see is when we read it, I've interpreted this, therefore it means.
And this is like why I always say it is really important to reread texts after a couple of years, because it will give you that experience like firsthand. You're like, yeah, when I first read Conan the Barbarian, I was like, yeah, that's my role model. I want to be like Conan. I read Robert E. Howard now. I still really enjoy those stories, at least some of them, a lot. They're fantastic. Robert E. Howard is a massively talented author. But I read them in an entirely different way. I'm reading them as a xenophobic incel trying to make sense of his world. And, and I don't blame him for being that person. That's not the point. I'm like, they mean very different things to me right now. And going back and reading, when I first read Lord of the Rings as a 13-year-old boy, I did not pick up on the classist element of it. Of course not, I did. I mean, how could I? But now I can't unsee it. And that like rereading and comparing to like where you are as a person in your life really helps you understand like how much of reading is actually happening like in our brains and how much of it is actually in the text.
Yeah, and you know, and the number of times that I've talked about this, that the reader is constructing meaning. They are actually constructing the meaning of the narrative, but the text remains fixed. And you know, this is why, you know, when I talk about how I used to review, that it was a text-centric review, because how I read it now, in 10 years' time, when I reread it, it's going to be different because I'm different. And so for a review to have lasting impact, I think you focus on the text, because the text doesn't change. Talk about what's in the text and what's going on in the text. But if I talk about how I felt when I read it, that is only applicable to me, and it's only applicable to me in that moment in time, because it's not necessarily applicable to me 5 years later, because I could have a completely different attitude to it because times change. But anyway, Raf, this has been a load of fun, but I actually have to go.
Me too. I was trying to find a way how to end this at this point, because I have to record a podcast on the best hard rock albums of 1973, and I'll include an Irish one. I'll definitely include The Tame by the Horselips, because I'm a huge Horselips fan.
Fantastic. Anyway, thanks a lot, Rob.
It was fantastic. Thank you again for doing this on like such short notice.
Bye-bye.
Bye.